There is no Dana. There is only Zool. This is the No Fear podcast. We know what scares you.
Hi, I'm Matt.
I'm Mel.
I'm Lisa.
And this is the No Fear Cast, the podcast where we dissect horror and all the things that scare us. This is Season 2, Episode 7, and this is the second episode of our series on possessions and exorcisms. Before we get started in our discussion this episode, I just wanted to take a moment to thank you listeners for listening to the show regularly. We hope you're enjoying what you're hearing. And we just want to ask you again, if you can, spread the word about this podcast. Tell your friends, tell your family members who you think may be interested in our topics. Rate, review us on iTunes, Apple Podcasts, so other people can find us. And if you would like to contribute to us financially, we do have a Patreon account where we do off-week episodes. So you would not only get these main episodes, but for a few dollars a month, you get to hear us talk on the off weeks about maybe extra things that didn't make it into the episode or background information for the main episode. So the last 2 or 3 Patreon mini eps, we've talked about the true story behind the book, The Exorcist. I think we talked at one point about the conspiracy theories behind the show Stranger Things. And last week we talked about Dybbuk boxes and possessions and exorcisms. So if you like what you hear here, there's plenty of extra content on Patreon for you to check out. Again, thanks for listening. Okay, in this episode, we are continuing our discussion of possessions, but we're taking a slightly different tack than we did last week. And instead of focusing so much on the exorcism part and the religious part per se, we want to talk about who typically gets possessed and what happens to that person, or how does that person's body, usually a female body, become kind of a battleground between contending forces, and what does this maybe say about our culture? So I'm sure you guys recognize the quotation from our intro that Lisa read, "There is no Dana, only Zool," coming from the Ghostbusters movie. So I'm going to toss it over to you, Lisa, to tell us a little bit more about possession and Ghostbusters.
Right. This is coming from an article that I had read in preparation for this episode, and it actually appeared on the website The Establishment, and we'll link to that either in the show notes or on social media so you guys can read it too. But this article makes a really interesting point, because while the Ghostbusters possession is not quite what we discussed in our last main episode, it's not quite the Catholic demonic, evil entity possession. They kind of do this weird mishmash of ancient gods and ghosts and just weird creatures that exist on the other side of the, realm from us. But one thing that they do keep, and this is coming from the 1984 Ghostbusters film, is the woman's body becoming the battleground for the possession. And even in that line that I read, "There is no Dana, there is only Zool," it's become iconic, but when you really think about it, and this is one of the things that the article really points out, is that Dana essentially loses her identity when she is possessed. She is no longer herself. And she has her physical body, but she has been erased from the equation. And that's a little bit different from other typically more Catholic demonic possessions, because in some of those you get the sense that the person is still in the body and is coexisting with the other entity. But here, there is no Dana. She's gone. And it becomes really interesting when you see how she acts before and after the possession. Because before the possession, she's very much a woman in control. She lives by herself. She's successful. And she has men who are making advances to her that she is repeatedly denying. So she's in control there. But as soon as Zool takes over, as soon as she loses control of her body, and as soon as she's essentially erased, one of the immediate things that happen is that she tries to seduce Dr. Venkman. And so you get that, which this is something that came from a lot of those demonic possession, kind of Catholic exorcism narratives that we talked about in the last episode, but the woman becomes this overly sexualized being and becomes the aggressor in a lot of ways. Her language becomes more aggressive. Her body language becomes more aggressive. She does things that would be considered shocking for a polite woman to do or for a quote unquote good girl to do. And so in this way, the possession of Dana really follows that narrative. And what is interesting and troubling at the same time is that as she's erased in this battle, she has to rely on essentially her heroes, the Ghostbusters, a group of men, to come in and save her. Because if they didn't, we get this idea that it would just be Zool forever, which is one thing, and this is something that the article points out, that made the new version, I guess the new reboot of the Ghostbusters franchise with all women, something that was very cutting edge, but was also very subversive, because for the first time, women were able to enter that battlefield and to become the heroes of the story, which is appropriate when you're thinking about a battleground that is literally a woman's body, which is what essentially a lot of these possession narratives are. I don't know. It was really, I enjoyed, obviously I love the original Ghostbusters and I loved the new one, but I thought that was a really interesting way of looking at it and looking at how our society views, especially gender roles, and how they're supposed to play out. I don't know, Mel, did you get a chance to read the article at all, or?
I did, and it got me thinking about those movies, which I'm a big Ghostbusters fan too, 1 and 2 and the new one. And after I read the article, I was really thinking about the character of Dana, and I guess I saw that when I was watching the movie, but I started thinking even more about her pre-possession and during, as it's, if you look. You're very right. She's a very possessed woman who's a self-possessed woman who is very successful in her career and very independent. But if you go back and look at the movie again, she's constantly being pursued by men that she's trying to rebuff, as you were saying. And so the lens of the film, like how we're watching it, is like her body is already in contention in a way between what Peter and Lewis is his name. I think that's his name, her neighbor, and even one of the guys in the symphony. It's like basically it's just Peter Venkman trying to win her. And then once the evil demon figure takes her over, like you said, there is no Dana, only Zool. Now she's possessed by another figure who's trying to use her, again, in a kind of a sexualized way, because remember, I think she's the gatekeeper, and Lewis, the person that she has not wanted to be with at all and has been trying to basically kind of evade his advances, is the key master. And I mean, I think, that's pretty heavy-handed metaphors there with what's supposed to be happening. And so while she's possessed, she's probably engaging in a relationship that she never wanted. And then at the end, in ways, she's saved by the male characters. And then also Peter gets her in the end. And so she's kind of won by the hero. And I was thinking to myself, like, Dana, in a lot of ways, you can watch it with that idea of this independent woman doing her own thing, but she's constantly fending off attacks from men and supernatural beings that want to take her over. And in the beginning, the men don't even believe her that there's a supernatural being in her apartment trying to take her over. And so she's constantly either under attack and not being believed, or being pursued, or people fighting over her as this battleground. I was like, wow, it just is the entire movie. And then I was thinking about Ghostbusters 2, and then she's a mother, right? And Peter's trying to get her back, and then the evil is trying to take her baby from her. And so there's constantly this aspect of her. Well, and the art gallery guy is after her as well. So again, you have two men vying for her that she's trying to rebuff. and then her child is the target of the supernatural being that wants to take her again, and we assume a sexualized manner. And so her body, her sexuality seems to always be kind of like, I don't know what the word is, like the target / prize for all these different forces contending. And then, yeah, you're right. In the new movie, it's like an equal opportunity possession, and it's the women as friends who help each other, right. As opposed to always being the target that's being kind of competed over by all these other forces.
Yeah. Well, I had so many thoughts while you were talking, Mel, but yeah, you're absolutely right. I mean, these possession narratives tend to hold up gender norms that society holds up, which is unusual because horror tends to be a subversive genre anyway. But in this kind of one case, it's not. And part of the problem, or part of the thing that I find so troubling with it, is that so many women are the subject of these narratives because women are viewed as maybe more vulnerable or perhaps submissive in some way. And when you think about it from that point of view, it's even more troubling and disturbing almost when you look at the case of someone like Dana, who starts off kind of against all odds as a thoroughly modern woman living her own life. And yes, she is, you're right, she's constantly a battleground, but she's fighting that battle, on her own terms. But in the end, she does lose all that because she becomes the prize. She is won as that prize. And then just the fact that she almost settles into a perfect picture of domesticity by the sequel, by becoming the mother, even though she's still more of a modern version of that, I guess. But just even putting her in the role where she's not even fighting for herself anymore, but she's now a mother figure, tends to hold up that idea of a traditional, one might even say patriarchal gender role that has been assigned to her. And when you compare that to who she was at the very beginning of the first Ghostbusters, it's kind of a sad story for Dana.
It really is. I mean, in the beginning of Ghostbusters 2, she's a single mom who had a child with someone other than the men who were pursuing her in the first movie. And by the end of the second movie, she's been persecuted as a mother. and then she becomes, she gets together with Peter again and creates this like domestic family. It's almost like every time she starts out as a strong character, she has to get punished and then turned into something that like quote unquote works better. This is, I got to rewatch those movies. It may make my head hurt now.
I know. I'm kind of regretting that we opened up this Ghostbusters can of worms. It may make me watch the movies differently because every time I'm going to be thinking, oh no, poor Dana.
Just move, Dana. Just move.
Because she does. You're absolutely right. Each one of those stories, she starts out as, kind of master of her domain, and, she has agency and she's fighting for what she wants, and she seems to be getting what she wants. And then by the end, she's always a prize to be won over. And part of becoming that prize means she gets put back in the traditional domestic role that she was kind of bucking at the beginning.
Also, when Zool and Gozer go after her, first they invade her refrigerator in the kitchen.
Ooh.
It's not just her space. It's like in her domestic space, her private space. They don't invade her bedroom until they invade her. They come out of the refrigerator.
Yeah. Wow. We should just retitle this podcast like Ruining Your Childhood Favorites.
Or coming up with awesome academic papers on your childhood favorites.
That is true.
Up next, we'll spend a good 20 minutes talking about the scariest scene in The Never-Ending Story, the one that we all hated as kids.
I don't know if my psyche can handle that tonight. Yeah, Mel, I had really never thought about, I definitely remember the haunted refrigerator because after seeing Ghostbusters as a child, that struck me in the same way that televisions did after I saw Poltergeist. And, I was always a bit suspicious of them from that point on. But when you think about the places that it does attack her, that's the first. And it attacks her, of course, in the bedroom because she's got to become overly sexualized. But even as a mother, there's the scene in the bathtub.
Yes, that's so creepy.
And yes, it is. But I don't think there's anything much more vulnerable for a mother than having your baby, in the bathtub like that, except maybe for the stroller rolling down the streets of New York City.
Yeah, that's pretty bad too. And the baby crawling on the on the outside of the building, on the edge of the thing, yeah.
Right. But it really does. I mean, the places that she's attacked and the ways that it manifests itself, it's hard to read those as not being symbolic of domesticity and kind of subverting what a woman is supposed to be doing, I guess, with her job. She's supposed to be in the kitchen or in the bedroom or taking care of her children. And those are the places that it attacks her. So, yeah, I think if she didn't end up as a prize by the end of it, then I may be able to say, well, maybe this is kind of subverting some gender norms. But, in the end, she kind of gets pushed back into those roles.
Well, and I was just thinking when you were talking, because actually I was flipping through channels earlier today, Ghostbusters 2 was on, and I watched the end of it. And it seems like in some ways that movie is a really creepy competition with not only for who gets Dana, but also for who gets to be the father of her child. Like, it's this bizarre paternity or patriarchal kind of paternity thing because, she's a single mom at the beginning. And then as Vigo, the Carpathian, is attacking her or whatever with this slime, she gets pushed further and further into Peter's house, which is where she's bathing the baby, and the slime comes after them. And then at the end, Vigo is like, this is my child and I'm going to possess him and I'm going to grow up and live and blah, blah, blah. At the end, the painting is magically changed. Remember, it's like almost like this weird, like Madonna type Renaissance picture, but it's the baby in the middle and the 4 Ghostbusters around him. I don't even think Dana's in the picture now that I think about it.
Well, I mean, it's what happens when you cross the streams.
It's what happens when you're a bad mom and you lose control of your child. No, I'm speaking as the people who did Ghostbusters, not myself. Again, Dana is punished because she did not watch her child properly. She was stolen by Vigo and then had to be rescued.
In a really strange way, we have the same sort of almost a repeat of what happens at the end of Bram Stoker's Dracula. You have the men fighting over Mina and trying to save her from this, essentially what is a monstrous entity attacking her body. She's literally becoming the monster, which is what happens to Dana. It's just by a little bit different means, but they're fighting to fight back that kind of monstrosity that's taking over Mina, and they each have to give blood to her. And then there's that strange scene towards the end where she names her child after all the men. Mm-hmm. And so in a way they kind of do claim that paternity. And that's almost what you have here. We just haven't changed anything in the last century.
Which is kind of sad.
But yeah, I guess that really is a pretty common trope now that I'm thinking about it.
I'm a woman who lives alone and I have a job. I need to watch out.
I would just be cautious opening your fridge tonight. That's all I'm saying.
I won't open my fridge and I won't go to any art museums and I won't run the bathtub.
Oh my gosh. But it did redeem itself with the reboot, right? So let's bring up the 2016 Ghostbusters.
Well, I'm glad that you brought up the 2016 Ghostbusters because, I feel like that movie was subject to so much unnecessary controversy before it came out. I mean, there were so many people on the internet who were just up in arms at the idea of a reboot featuring an all-female principal cast. And, you know, I have to say I was skeptical of the movie, not because it was all-female cast, but because I just wasn't sure. I wasn't the hugest fan of Melissa McCarthy, to be honest, and that's really it. Personally, I had no problem that it was all women. I thought, oh, Kristen Wiig, I like her. She's done good stuff. I was not familiar with, and of course I'm drawing a blank on her name right now, but the actress who's on Saturday Night Live who played Holtzman, and
Kate McKinnon.
Yes, thank you, Kate McKinnon. And Leslie Jones, I've always liked her stuff, but I was just like, I don't know. I don't always like Melissa McCarthy, but of course I was willing to give it a chance, and I'm super glad I did because I thought it was great. I know, Lisa, you said that you liked it, but I think what I liked about it was how they playfully really had fun with kind of inverting that stereotype, because Chris Hemsworth playing the dumb as a box of rocks, stereotypical eye candy as a guy with these 4 female Ghostbusters, I thought was great. And I thought he played that role so well. I mean, he was part of the funniest. I mean, I laughed super hard at him, but although I have to say, Holtzman was my favorite by far. I mean, Holtzman was the greatest character in that movie. Like, I was pretty much cackling every time Kate McKinnon was on screen, I feel like. So, but yeah, I think that, you know, for a movie coming out in 2016, I'm not going to be one of those people who says that, oh, well, it has to always be about diversity and inclusion and all that stuff. But, you know, it's a good thing, you know, for all these people writing it off just out of hand, oh my gosh, female Ghostbusters, it's the end of the world. Give it a rest. I'm sorry. You know, like if your quibble is because there's a black stormtrooper in Star Wars or female Ghostbusters, just try watching the movie before you make your decision, you know. Sorry, I feel like I'm getting into a bit of a soapbox rant there, but yeah.
Well, I'll join you on your soapbox any day because I completely agree.
Yeah, me too.
You know, I mean, yeah, I mean, it's just, I don't know what else to say about that, but if you haven't seen the new Ghostbusters movie, the 2016 version, it's actually a really funny, well-done movie. And, you know, and I say actually as if like I'm trying to have to justify the fact that it's funny, but for me, that's more because I'm always skeptical of any reboot, you know? Like, it's so rare for a reboot to be good. You know, It's Actually Funny has nothing to do with the cast. So, yeah, I like the fact that there's this complete inversion because, yeah, okay.
Well, I agree with you. You know, I was a little disheartened to see the reaction of most of the internet before the movie had even come out and how many people were so upset. And my whole thing with the reboot was, you know what, even if it's bad, which it wasn't, but I was like, even if it's bad, you still have the original. Like, I've never understood why people get so upset over remakes or reboots, because it's not like it's permanently erasing the original. You always can go back and watch the 1984 Ghostbusters. Nobody's going to make you sit down and watch the new one. And I'm so glad that I did, because Kate McKinnon was brilliant. Just absolutely brilliant.
Stole the show.
But yeah, after we've talked about all the things that were troublesome about the original, and now that I'm thinking back to this new one, what was so nice for me was not only getting to see the females be heroes and be the ones who come in and save the day, but that you saw so many different types of female characters. And that was one of the things that I loved about Kate McKinnon, is just how wonderfully weird and bizarre she played off that character. And, you know, you had women who were smart, and then, you know, some women who weren't so smart, and some who were, you know, really ready to go in there and take names. And and, were courageous, and you had some who were, shyer and more fearful of what was to come and nervous even. And the one kind of token male character, as you put it, Matt, was dumb as rocks, but his body almost became the battleground.
He was the one possessed at the end.
Yeah. True. And it was played, almost for comic effect, but leading up to that, the women were talking about him as if he were a prize to be won. And it's almost justification for everything that Dana went through in the original to be able to see that was satisfying from an audience perspective, I think.
Yeah, I thought that was interesting because I think that goes back to you were saying the different types too. Like each of the women were their own individual, and so I think there's a Kristen Wiig character was kind of more into the secretary than even the other ones were, because they all had their own kind of interests or strengths or roles. But I just, I don't, as a Ghostbusters fan, as a woman who is a huge Ghostbusters fan and will always watch Ghostbusters 1 and 2, seeing 4 women being Ghostbusters and the hero was so awesome. And I think I'd just seen so many movies where the women were kind of, pawns, wherever men were the heroes, that seeing it was refreshing to me, like seeing all those kind of, I don't know what's the word I'm looking for, routine kind of ways we set up movies or films, kind of blown out of the water. Was just really fun. And yeah, the complete inversion of some of the things in the other movie was wonderful. I mean, the first time one of the Ghostbusters gets possessed, it's another Ghostbuster who helps her. They don't need any outside help. They take care of each other, and they have the knowledge to do it. They're not necessarily victims. And I thought that was really cool as well. It takes that idea of the female body as the battleground of outside forces completely out of the equation. Or like you said, there is no Dana. It's only Zool versus the Ghostbusters. And in the movie, they were kind of able to handle it. And I thought that was really neat too. The movie was fun. It was funny, and it was a great homage to the idea of Ghostbusters, but with women as the main characters.
Yeah, I agree. and I think all we're really saying here, and we kind of brushed past it earlier, so I want to bring it up. But I did enjoy seeing the women be the Ghostbusters, but I still enjoy seeing the original Ghostbusters in the original movie. So to me, it's not even about gender, but we can have possessions and possession movies that give all the genders a chance.
Everybody gets to be a victim.
That's what I love about like the Evil Dead movies, is even in the original ones that, Sam Raimi did, people got possessed right and left, and it didn't matter if you were a man or a woman. Everyone had an equal opportunity to, have their body taken over. And that was nice to see. And even in the original, we had a male hero. In the reboot, they kind of switched it up a little bit, and I appreciated that, because I thought, that's always kind of been an equal opportunity possession series, so it makes sense that the hero would be allowed to have equal opportunity as well.
Okay, I'm going to pause you there, Lisa, talking about equal opportunity possession, and transition us back to the 19th century and spiritualism. And listeners, if you haven't listened to our occult series from the first season, we talked a lot about spiritualists and spiritualism. I think we had a whole episode devoted to it, so you might want to check that out. But one of the interesting things when you think about possession in these kinds of ideas, whereas it's like generic demons, I guess would be the best way to put it, or dead people, ghosts, which I think is part of the possession in the movie The Conjuring. In the spiritualist movement, there was kind of a different definition of possession, that instead of victimizing, let's put it that way, vulnerable women characters, women use possession as a way to gain some sort of voice or power in a society that often didn't really pay attention to them. In the 19th century, it was very difficult for women to marry chosen partners, to divorce if they needed to they couldn't vote. There were legal issues with inheriting property, those sorts of things. Women weren't always listened to in, say, speeches or lectures. They just didn't really have a popular or voice in society. And so you have spiritualists, women who would do seances for people and connect them to their dead loved ones, who often would use what they called a spirit control, which basically, if you're a trance medium, you go into a trance and your control is usually, not always, but usually the same person per se. So some spiritualists would have Ben Franklin for their control. So Ben Franklin would be speaking through them, or Socrates, or Napoleon, or other, usually male figures from history. Not always male, but usually male figures from history. And the control would kind of basically control what was going on. So the medium technically wasn't talking. Whatever was coming out of her mouth was being said by the control. The control would allow people who were dead to move forward and take control of the medium and speak to the people around the table. And we talked a lot about what's the word I'm looking for? The shams and trickery that went on during these things. But the interesting thing about spirit control is that sometimes they would just go off on these long, passionate speeches in favor of social reform. So lots of spirit controls would go on these long diatribes against slavery and support abolition. They would go on long diatribes about temperance. They were especially pro-women voting. And so you have these women, maybe not all mediums were women, but a lot of women mediums who were using these male controls, usually famous people from history, to basically say all the things that they couldn't normally say, or that people wouldn't pay attention to them if they did say. And so you have this really interesting connection between the women's rights movement and spiritualists and feminists. And I know, Lisa, you're really interested in the historical person of Victoria Woodhull, so I'm going to pass it to you for some description of her life.
Oh my gosh. Yeah, well, just to kind of go along with what you were saying, Mel, when we've been talking about possession and exorcism in particular, really we've been talking about the women's body as a battleground, either against some sort of patriarchal gender norms, or more specifically in the case of exorcisms, specifically the Catholic Church. And as you pointed out, women often had a way of finding a platform for their voice when they were not given any. And the Fox sisters that we talked about in our previous episode on spiritualism, they were kind of the perfect example of that, because they were given large audiences based on, their powers. Whether or not you believe what they were doing, they certainly gained a following and they gained an audience, and they were able to say what they needed to say. And I think, since they're kind of credited with starting spiritualism, when you look at spiritualism as a religion, I think so many women were attracted to it because of exactly what you were describing, Mel, that they were given a platform and they were able to become a mouthpiece. And I always find it interesting that a lot of these women, when they channeled spirits, it was often spirits of men that they knew the audience would respect. Like suddenly Ben Franklin's coming through, or, and he's speaking out, or, it was always people that they thought, okay, well, they'll listen to what they have to say. And as you said, they brought up topics that were pertinent to the day. And so it was a really kind of subversive movement disguised as a religion, a new religion almost. And Victoria Woodhull is absolutely one of my favorite characters, probably right up next to the Fox sisters. And just to give you a little bit of background about her life and how she used this newfound platform. She was born in 1838. Her name was Victoria California Claflin. And I hit that her name is California because she had a younger sister named Tennessee. But she grew up, I think, one of like 10 children. She was somewhere in the middle there, and in a very poor family in a pretty much a shack in the middle of Ohio. So this is where this woman was born, and she was uneducated. She herself said that she had never spent even a year in a schoolroom, although people have said that maybe she got some schooling for about maybe 2 or 3 years. But she had a pretty sad life growing up. Like I said, she was really poor. Her mother was fairly unpleasant. Her father was abusive towards them and kind of a bit of a con artist, I guess is how he would describe him today. But she was forced by her father to kind of go out on the road and participate in his cons. And part of that was being like either like a fortune teller or maybe a faith healer or, you know, some sort of clairvoyant, and she could speak with the dead. And they would put on these kind of shows. And so that's how she grew up in her childhood. And so you can see how she would move easily from somebody who would play at being a fortune teller or somebody who could speak to the dead, that she could move very easily into spiritualism. And in fact, she married several men, but one of the men she married was very much into spiritualism. And he believed, you know, that there were spirits and maybe even angels out there who could commune with us and talk with us and help guide us through our life. And so that is kind of how she entered into this movement. And he really, I think, encouraged her in her pursuit of knowledge later on in life. And she became very interested in women's rights. And one of the things, there's so much about her life that I could go into that I'm not going to go into just for time's sake. I will tell you, though, there's a great book called Other Powers, if you want to read more about her life, because she's absolutely fascinating. But if I'm going to fast forward just a little bit in her life, before women even had the right to vote, and as you said, Mel, a lot of these spiritualists would you know, kind of take up the cause, trying to get women the right to vote. She actually ran for president. She was the first woman in our country to declare her candidacy for the U.S. presidency, and that happened in 1870. And I just find her fantastic because here's this woman who, you know, she's a spiritualist. And if you look at spiritualism, yes, it was a trend of the day, but it was also kind of bucking the Christian tradition that a lot of people were following. And, you know, she's standing in rebellion against that. And she's standing in rebellion against the patriarchy and even to some degree the way she was raised and going and seeking knowledge where she could find it when she certainly was not raised that way. But then to run for president in a country that would not let you vote, I think is just a fantastic thing to do. And yeah, she's one of my favorite characters, I think, maybe in all of history. So that's Victoria Woodhull. But it kind of fits nicely into our discussion of possessions and how, you know, these narratives seem to be so anti-feminist, I guess, but how some people can still find a power and can subvert those traditional gender norms and gender roles by using possession, whether or not you want to believe that the spirit possession that these people are doing are real, or whether or not you want to believe it's a play for an audience. It kind of doesn't matter because, you know, these women are using the quote unquote spirits in their own bodies as a mouthpiece without letting people know that that's what they're doing. And I think that's fantastic.
Yeah, her case is just so fascinating. I love how she ran for president with the Equal Rights Party in the 1870s. Douglas
Right.
to be her vice president. I mean, he never called back, but you know, that's pretty progressive.
I completely left that out. Yeah, she wanted Frederick Douglass to be her vice president, and man, yeah.
Yeah, I also loved in my reading about her that you passed on to us the fact that her belief in free love. When we say free love now, we think of it so differently. All she wanted was women to be able to choose who they married and be able to divorce if they needed to. It's like, that's all, people. She was a bit more radical than that later in her life. But yeah, that was the movement, the free love movement. Women should not be forced to marry people they don't want. And if they marry someone abusive, they should be able to divorce him. Wow.
Yeah.
It's pretty sad that, you know, no women could vote for her because she might have been able to make a dent.
Well,
you know?
Yeah, and just the fact that she couldn't have even cast a vote for herself.
Right.
And yeah, of course. I mean, the nation pretty much destroyed her after that because, I think she was evicted from her home and, kind of found herself in some financial problems after that. And, there were all sorts of, political cartoons and nasty caricatures of her that followed, kind of presenting her as like a witch-like character or, even kind of a devil. And yeah, it's just kind of sad to see that as you pointed out, Mel, she really wanted so little. She wanted equal rights, but, really she wanted to be able to choose who she married, and she wanted women to be able to leave abusive relationships, which you can imagine, growing up in the way she did, why she would want something like that. And
her first husband was an alcoholic too. So
right.
She knew of what she was speaking.
And then to have people ridicule her and ostracize her in such a way it's disheartening. But again, just her courage, and I don't know if gumption's the right word, but, her ability to just kind of be like, you know what? You won't let me vote? Fine, I'll run for president. I love it.
Yeah, Lisa, when you were talking about Victoria Woodhull, and we're talking about how women kind of gain power through being mediums and using these spirit controls, I was thinking to myself that nowadays, and I think we've talked about this a little bit before, but it seems like now when we say possession, we automatically think it must be a demon. We sometimes will think there's religion involved. It always seems like has these kind of negative connotations and is specifically kind of an invasion of one's body. And it's so interesting to see women kind of using it for the opposite effect. And when we were doing research for this episode, I came across a case in the 1870s of a girl named Laurency Venom, who was called the Watsika Wonder, who was supposedly possessed by a spiritualist daughter. So she was supposedly possessed by a girl named Mary Rolfe, who had died, I believe, relatively young, like teenage, I believe. And the girl, Venom, was almost admitted to an asylum before spiritualists convinced her family that she was simply hosting spirits. And I think nowadays, if you said somebody was possessed, as the psychologist William James said Venom might have been, or at least as he said it was a compelling form of possession as he'd seen in modern times, nowadays, if we said this, we would either think she had a multiple personality disorder of some sort, which is what people think that probably her issue was, or we would just say, oh, well, she must have been like a medium and should have been doing seances or something. But at the time, if a demon or the spirit of a dead person or a spirit of a historical person, as you were describing, Lisa, entered someone, there wasn't much difference between saying someone was a physical medium or trance medium or someone was possessed by something. And I think we talked last episode about how with The Exorcist and other movies of that ilk, we kind of forget that possession has been a much more general term in history, especially occult history. And so I think this is probably a good place to end, because this is kind of a transition into what we're going to be talking about next time, which is more atypical possession. So possession by ghost, possession by history, possession by trauma, this idea that it's not always, say, a demon that's victimizing someone or entering someone's body, but that there can be other types of possession, kind of playing off this idea of spiritualism's possession by the dead. So with that little bit to whet your appetite, listeners, we'll end there. Thank you for listening, and we'll talk to you next time.